With spring coming up, it's great to see green grass, especially out in your pastures. But here's the problem. You're going to have weeds. How will you control those weeds? That's what we want to talk about today.
First of all, Brian, we need to group these weeds up a little bit. We can talk about annual weeds in one category, lump perennial and biennial weeds in another category, and then lump woody species or even trees or brush in a different category here, because there's going to be control methods that you use for each. With the annual weeds, for example, many farmers or ranchers will just use a dicamba application or maybe a 2,4-D application. It's pretty inexpensive. You're going to get control. It's not going to leave you with a whole lot of residual out in the pasture, which really isn't a big deal. If you wipe out the weeds once and you get good grass growth, you should be in pretty good shape.
All right, rather than just using 2,4-D or dicamba, personally, I'd rather see a person use Distinct. Distinct has a little bit of dicamba in there, but the main weed killer is diflufenzapyr. It's a different active ingredient that we don't commonly use in agriculture. So you've got two active ingredients. It's going to be superior to 2,4-D and to dicamba in terms of weed control, and it's really not very expensive.
Unless the pasture has been newly seeded or it was overgrazed in recent years, we don't have a lot of annual weed pressure. We have more biennial and perennial weed pressure. We see a lot of different types of thistles, for example, out in pastures that really need to get under control. If you can get them in the first year of their life cycle, like with biennials, if you catch them in the rosette stage, like with a bull or a musk thistle, for example, you can do a really nice job controlling them before they become a big problem. Because once we get into year 2, they go into the bolt stage and they're trying to put on a seed head and reproduce, and that can be a tough time to get them under control. So be after these things early this spring.
Here's what I would use. If I have a major thistle problem, I'm going milestone. If I have leafy spurge, I'm probably going tordon. In terms of other perennials, just depends on what you have. You can look on the label. There are a lot of products out there. Some have tremendous residual, as do both milestone and tordon. So you got to be really careful. If it's something you're going to rotate to another crop, maybe 2 or 3 or even 4 years down the line, you still need to be thinking about what are your choices today. We talked earlier about dicamba, 2,4-D, distinct. Those can burn down a lot of the perennials. They probably aren't going to completely control them, but they don't have so much residual. So if you say, well, hey, next year already, I want to raise some legume crop out there, don't be using milestone or tordon. But if it's going to be long-term pasture, those are excellent choices.
All right, let's move on to that third category, the woody species. A lot of brush and even some small volunteer trees will get out into pasture or rangeland, and we want to wipe that out. And here's why, because I do get questions from people, why do you have to kill those? Because they use a lot of moisture and they use a lot of nutrients, and we have less grass growth around them. So we want to get them out. If you want to have them off to the side of a pasture, no problem. But if they're out in the middle, they can create some issues for you. So we'll look at different products here depending on what you're going to do with that pasture down the road.
Chaparral is usually our #1 brush product we're talking about. That's a combination of ally and milestone. It has very, very long residual. So again, we got to be really careful about what we're rotating to. If you are going to rotate to some other crop next year, I would strongly consider Remedy Ultra. That does not have all the residual that the chaparral does.
Well, there's certainly a lot more products than what Brian and I just discussed here. So if your agronomist is recommending something else besides these products, it might work fine too. You know, the challenges here in pasture though are how to get this stuff applied and what time of year to do it, because you got so many other things going on. I like the early spring. We don't have a lot of crops up around the pasture, so if there is just a small amount of drift, or you're going to use a product like dicamba or 2,4-D, you don't have as much worry about hurting something else in an off-target type application. But the other thing here is you've got some time in the early spring to get things done. So get out there, whether it's with your sprayer or with an aerial application, and use as much water and as much pressure as you can with most of these products to get good coverage. Because again, we're talking about weeds that are growing out in a pasture. So there's grass growth. So getting good coverage is not easy, and the better the coverage, the better the weed control.
We also get a lot of questions from people saying, well, instead of spraying in the spring, should I just wait and spray my pastures in the fall? Look, anytime you have weeds, go get them under control. We don't want to wait. The other thing is some people that say, oh, I'm going to spray in the fall, they don't get around to it, then the freeze hits, then they spray after the frost. Well, that doesn't work super well either. You always want to spray before your first frost of the fall. Just get your weeds sprayed this spring. That's our #1 piece of advice today.
The other thing, Brian, is we talk to a lot of people that say, well, I don't want to spend much money out in my pasture. Depending on where you're at, pasture rent is pretty expensive and hay is really expensive. So if you're lucky enough to have some pasture ground, you need the best grass growth you can. So getting weeds under control is certainly going to greatly improve your grass growth out in the pasture. And the other thing is some of the premium products, like we talked about Milestone and Tordon, for example, they're going to give you season-long residual on most of these weeds, or an application of a 2,4-D or dicamba product is going to be a very short-term weed control option.
If you want to buy a premix, like let's say Grazon or Grazon Next, we don't really love those products. You can use them certainly, but if you're just after perennials or you really want to get your perennials under control, use a strong rate of something that will actually kill the perennial, because you know that dicamba and 2,4-D will not. And many times what happens is the 2,4-D or dicamba shuts the plant down before that good perennial herbicide can actually get all the way through the extensive root system of that weed, and you don't get the control that you were looking for. So certainly in your worst perennial areas, use straight Milestone or use straight Tordon.
Well, there's a lot of choices for you with pasture weed control, and one of the weeds that you just might be after is our Weed of the Week. We'll show you how to stop this tough weed later in the show.